So this week, let's take a look at what our church signs are. The first one is "Who's your daddy?"
Wow.
So Thursdays was "You can't have everything. Where would you put it?" And I know with our house, since Rita doesn't listen to this, we need to get rid of a lot of stuff.
It's
So
better not to have a big house. I can tell you that right now.
exactly.
Or have 3 extra
People.
Yes.
people.
Yes.
I should say 2 and a dog, but the dog has as much.
Fridays was "Be grateful when your mood is high and graceful when your mood is low." That's a good one. I like that one. So, anger makes you smaller, but forgiveness helps you grow. So, in the middle of my little mess, I forget how big I'm blessed. I like that one. I like that one too. Those are good ones. Heart and Soul is a piano duet. Make it a prayerful one too. So those are our ones for this week. So let's go around and see how everybody's doing. Who would like to start?
Good idea.
Well, mine again. Like I said, I'm just really still tired because I was up pretty late on Monday with going with my mother-in-law. Because like I said, she's doing fine. She's doing fine now. So.
But she's still in the hospital.
No, she's.
Oh, she did come home.
Yeah, she came home the same day. So that's.
Oh, because they don't have room.
Yeah, they don't have room. So she was there, but she's back home. She's feeling better.
But at least they're living close to you and not in San Antonio.
Right. Like I said, when I thought her dad texted me that night, said, "Oh, just call me after dinner. We just want to,
I don't want to rush you.
I don't want to rush you." So he calls me and says, "Well, we're thinking about maybe going to the ER tomorrow." I said, "Why tomorrow?" I'm like, "Why are you making a plan?" I said, if you need to go, you need to go now, not tomorrow." "Well, I'm like, "I'll take you." So, and I took him over, and it went fine. But like I said, So I'm still I didn't realize till today. I was doing pretty good yesterday, but today I'm just like, I'm tired. So if I'm a little tired during Bible study, just wake me up.
Your vehicle is all taken care of.
Oh yeah, so there's a funny story with that. So I get it to the dealership yesterday, and I was like, okay, so it's the sensor on this particular tire. It's out, and about 45 minutes later, he comes out. There's nothing wrong with the sensor, nothing wrong with the flow valve. I'm like, but I said the tire went down to 30. He says, "Yeah, you have a nail in your tire."
Oh.
I'm like, well, I'm glad. And then this is where I feel blessed. I'm like, I'm glad God got us to Iowa and back,
Yes.
and to Chautauqua and back, with a tire with a nail in it. So I'm like, okay. He's like, "Yeah, it'll cost you $30. We'll get it fixed." I'm like, okay, that's great. So yeah, so I guess I'm just taking it in next time, no matter what. I'm just going to drive it in and say, okay, I don't know if it's a nail or what it is. So.
Where have you been driving?
Oh, like I said, I do enough. Yeah, just on the road and stuff like that. So.
With all the roofs being
Yeah.
there's a possibility of roofing nails everywhere.
Oh, I know.
Sarah picked up just trap rock the other day on her way to work, and by the time she got there, she heard the air going out. It was going psst. So she called there, and he said, "I'll be there at 2:30," because they were both in Hudson. Her maintenance guy went and took it off, took it to where it had to be, had it fixed, and put it back on before Darren even got there, which was very nice. That happened a couple weeks ago.
I had one time with a tire, and it was about this long
Wow.
in my tire, and they were going to throw it away, and I says, I'm going to keep that one. I've never seen such a big thing in my life that caused my tire to go down.
Huh.
But they're big. Once you hit them, they're good
Oh, yeah.
size.
Yeah. Well, let's get started with Bible study for today. So we're going to be in Kings today. And so as we think about Kings, just give you a little context about the Book of Kings. So it's found in the Old Testament. It concludes the Deuteronomist history, a history of Israel. Also includes the book of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. So it's sort of the conclusion to sort of what the history of what Israel was like. So people were trying. So the reason why do you think the Book of Kings was written? Why do you think they wrote the Book of Kings?
I can read you what my Bible says.
Absolutely.
I can't take credit for it, but the purpose of the book was not only to record the history of these kings, but to show that the success of any king and of the nation as a whole depended on the measure of his allegiance to God's law.
Absolutely. What's the big event? What's one of the really big events that the people of Israel were really trying to figure out later in life? So this is after the Exodus, and there was a big event that happened.
I've got, why are we in exile?
There we go. Why are we in exile? So this is a big thing that the people of Israel are trying to really figure out. So eventually, what happens is if I remember right, the Babylonians conquer that part of the world, and then they take people from Israel out of their hometown or out of their own country, send them back to Babylon. And the people of Israel are trying to figure out, what did we do wrong? What happened that the promise, the covenant that God made with us, it doesn't seem to be honored right now. We are in a foreign land among foreign people. We don't know how long we're going to be here. They didn't think they'd ever go back home. And so you have these people who are in Babylon going, well, what did we do wrong? How do we explain the situation that we're in right now? Because I don't know about you, but when something bad happens, don't we always want to try to find meaning in it, right? That helps us sort of process the events. Is how do we attach a meaning to it? Well, my car tire was bad because I ran through a construction site, or I got sick because I went out in the cold with wet hair. We try to we try to explain what's going on. What happens? Why did this bad thing happen to us? We're trying to figure out a purpose and why. And so this is what the people of Israel are doing right now with the Book of Kings. Is they're like, so what happened? Why are we here now? This can't be part of God's plan. We must have really screwed up. So how did we screw up? Well, we need to start back at the beginning. And they start to work their way through what happened, because everything was great under David, right? They had a big kingdom, and then you have who we're going to talk about today, Solomon's, David's son. Hey, everything's going great again, and then it sort of doesn't. And I would actually make the argument that even with David, things weren't as good as they should have been or could have been. And some of it goes back to when we think of all this, did God want the people of Israel to have a king? No. And so some of it goes back to that, is that the people of Israel had always wanted a king. And God warned them, when the king showed up, it ain't going to be a bed of roses. It's not going to be butterflies and unicorns. There's going to be stuff that you're not going to like. Bad stuff that's, oh no, we're going to be just fine. It's going to be great. And God's like, no, you're not. And so steadily over a period of time, the people of Israel begin to see that, yes, it's not great. I mean, some kings do really good. Other kings really don't. And so the Book of Kings is instead of just a history, it has history in it, but is more a theological explanation of how they got to the point. How did the nation of Israel get broken into two pieces? because that can't have been God's plan, right? Why would God want two separate countries? And so we go from, so this includes a history of about 400 years. So that's the cool thing about the Book of Kings. And it's broken up into two parts. We'll do the second part next week. And so, yeah. So let me give you a little context as to where we begin with this. So David's still alive at this particular point. When 1 Kings begins, David's still alive. If you ever think the Bible is boring, just read some of the history stuff. This is like more exciting than a lot of the novels that you get right now. At this particular point in time, so David's old, and they're trying to figure out the succession. Well, Solomon wasn't the only person who was going to succeed David. They had a conflict. I know you're shocked that there's conflict within a family, conflict within a church, conflict within a nation. So David's fourth son, I'm going to spell it for you because otherwise I'll get it wrong. Adonigah, claims the throne. Says, "Yep, I'm on the throne." He's had the loyalty of David's general and the priest, and so they begin to go through the ceremony. Say, "Okay, this is going to be their new king." Well, they didn't talk to David about that. It's not really a good way to start. So, and so what happens then is Bathsheba talks to David and says, "Hey, this is what's going on." And she also loops Nathaniel into that. Nathaniel is one of the prophets at that time. And so what happens is they actually put Solomon on the throne. And David does the whole thing with him. And so now you have two people that are sort of on the throne. And so how does that work out when you have two people that are real good rulers? So, but so the fourth son hears about this, that even in the midst of his celebration, they hear this other celebration. Well, what's going on down there? Oh, yeah, Solomon just became king. Oh, I thought I was going to be king. Well, that didn't work out. Well, then he asked for sanctuary. And Solomon honors that for a little while. But all the people that had supported this other person to be king, David's fourth son, all end up dying. Because you knew that sort of just was going to happen. So, and then we get to Solomon. So Solomon's king. So out of a very interesting way of how the kingdom got passed to him. So Solomon makes an allegiance with Egypt and marries Pharaoh's daughter. And after this, he continues the ancient practice of traveling between the high places and offering sacrifices. So there's different places where they have temples for God. They're called the high places because they're up high. They're up on, yeah, they're closer to God. So that's why they're called that.
That's why we have steps in church, right?
Correct. So we can be closer to God. So, then this is sort of where we pick up today. So at Gibeon, God speaks to Solomon in a dream and offers him anything he asks for. So that's what we're going to find out today. So where we're at right now. So Solomon's really new in his reign. Not a lot has happened, and so we have this dream, and so that's what we're going to pick up today and see what Solomon asked for. What would you ask for if God said, "I'll give you anything"? What do you want? What would be your?
And then he woke up.
And he woke up. Yes. But I just before we even read, what would you ask for God for? Excuse me. If you could have anything.
Well,
anything else.
Most people would say wealth, and that's not what Solomon said. I mean, God
Right.
was surprised that we want wealth or
Yeah.
something to take care of us. But
what would you want? What would you want? If God could say you could have anything at all, what would you want?
Health.
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 Health. Yeah. That would be, I would agree with that. Health would be a great thing. So. Well, let's jump into the text. We are, it's a long text. So, because we're actually going to just read straight through.
Why did they skip some verses?
Oh,
The
they,
important verses.
yeah, they, we'll end up reading those today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the narrative lectionary. They just do their best to pick a set of verses because they also don't want people to be up there reading as long either. So, all right. So who'd like to read us? So it's 1 Kings chapter 3 verses 4 through 9. Who'd like to do 4 through 9?
I'll start.
Okay.
The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?"
And then 10 through 15.
I can go. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and you have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. I now do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before you, and no one like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare with you. If you will walk in my ways, keeping your statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life." Then Solomon awoke. It had been a dream. He came to Jerusalem, where he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. He offered up burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, and provided a feast for all his servants.
16 through 20.
Then 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. It happened on the 3rd day after I gave birth that this woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the 2 of us in the house. This woman's son died in the night because she lay on it. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom."
How about 21 through, how about through the rest? 21 through 28.
When I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, "No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours." The first said, "No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine." Thus they spoke before the king. Then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead.' And the other says, 'No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one.' And the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, 'Divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one and half to the other.' Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, 'O my lord, give the living child and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice.
Perfect.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. That worked out really well. We had nice music for that.
That's nice music. Telephone.
Um,
Did they get that? Whatever it was.
so the interesting thing, so there's some things when we look at the text that I think are very interesting, but I want to get your thoughts about this particular text. So we learn about Solomon. Solomon wants wisdom, and we see him, like any good story, we see him in action. We just don't see that God gave him wisdom, and we don't see an example of it, but we see an example right away. God has given Solomon wisdom. We have this very interesting story, and we see that he uses his wisdom and uses it well. He uses wisdom for life, right? So the child's life was saved at the end of the day. But what else have you? What do you find interesting about this passage, or just Solomon in general?
Well, the one thing that we read about him being it said in mine, a young boy or something, that he was, what age was he when he took the throne?
It's a good question. I'd have to look. He was.
I'm only a child, it says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it said I only a child, that's what we read.
But that must be in the, I should say,
in his mind.
in his mind.
yeah.
He's not mature enough to take over the job as being king.
Kind of talking about his experience, not
Yeah.
being
Experience,
great.
yeah.
And
But-
the footnote says it's just a figure of speech to express lack of experience.
Yeah.
Solomon actually had a child of his own.
Oh,
Okay. So he wasn't a child.
Yes. So he was probably, I want to say probably in his 20s, at least 20s or 30s. So the interesting thing about Solomon, though, is how did he rule?
personally. I mean, he saw these women face to face. That's kind of interesting in and of itself, that
Yeah.
he would be the one dealing with them on this issue.
Yeah, it is really interesting that you have a case like this. That's sort of like if you think of a case that we see in court right now being brought to the governor or even to the president of the United States and say, okay, well, here you go. Here's these two people that have a domestic, situation. How are you going to handle that, Mr. President? So it's interesting that,
How busy he would be.
yeah, you'd be very busy. But but when we think of that as well too, it shouldn't surprise us that he would do something like this. Why would I say that? Why? When you think of who God is, if he's being God's representative, and God especially has told the Israelites time and time again that God is always for who? Besides just a general people, there's three groups of people that God really holds
Widows
up.
and the children and
Right.
The poor.
Yes, absolutely. So God is all about this. So it makes sense that we have a case like this where we're dealing with women, with people being poor, children as well too. That this case sort of wraps all those three things up, and we see him as God's representative because that's what God has always said. God is always about how do we treat the poor, how do we treat children and stuff like that. That's really has always been a big deal. So I'll ask the question again. Do you think Solomon was a good king? Not with just this particular story, but from what you know of him overall.
He was wise. He was given the knowledge.
He was given the knowledge. And all
He was until the wealth got to him.
Had
ah,
all those
yes.
women in there to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What?
700 wives, 300 concubines. Just
Wow.
One king's plenty.
yes.
I'm glad you feel that way.
One concubine or one wife?
I was thinking that this story, to me, is predestination,
Interesting.
because Solomon's wisdom shows through only because the second woman didn't say, okay, good, because it's my son, I want him.
Right.
She said, no, go ahead and divide it. So,
Yeah. No. Like I said, his wisdom comes through. And like I said, I think it's when the riches get to him that he does not. And it's interesting as we read the text too that as long as if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, then I will lengthen your life. And I think God puts that in there because I think God also knows the temptation of riches and wealth and stuff like that. And so
It's funny that in his dream he did right.
yeah,
Or
and this is not to say Solomon didn't do a lot of good things. The thing is, and I'm not saying he's a bad king. I think you have to make that judgment on that because at the end of the day, he actually coerced his countrymen and women to do hard labor. And I think they all remember every year they celebrate being free from slavery, and yet you have your king, the person who's supposed to be looking out for you now, is doing the same thing that your leaders in Egypt were doing. And so is Solomon really listening to what God is saying, or is Solomon more concerned with what Solomon wants? And the other thing you can look at too is there was two great structures that were created when Solomon was alive. What were those two structures? What were those two buildings that were created?
The temple.
The temple.
And Solomon's palace,
Yep.
right?
And which one took longer?
His palace.
His palace took twice as long as it took to make the temple. I wonder how that sort of fits out there. So I think so it's interesting that God's house took half as much time as Solomon's house. So again, we see God speaking way before Solomon ever became king, saying, your kings are going to rule over you. Your kings are not always going to think and do the best for you. And here's the instance of this powerful king who's done a lot of good, but at the same time, like David, we're not perfect. Solomon was not perfect. There was a lot of things he did and he did wrong, but there's a lot of things he did right. So the hard part of this is, was he a good king or a bad king? As we look at that, and you can say yes to both. So the other interesting thing I want to talk about here is that I think really applies to today, especially today, is so Don, you sort of mentioned this as well too. You have the two women. So one, yes, let the other woman have the child because I want the child to live. The other woman, it sounds a little harsh, but let it all burn, basically, right? Kill the child, let it all burn. If I can't have it, you can't have it either. I think for myself, as I look in the world right now, I see a lot more of that mentality in our politics, in our social structures, where people are like, if I can't have it, you can't either. We see that a lot in domestic abuse as well, too. If I can't have her or him, no one will have him or her. And so I think this story that we hear, the ladies that are arguing over the baby, really applies to us today. You can look at it as a metaphor of, when we argue with somebody, do we argue for life or do we argue for death with people? So I would argue that we do that with death a lot of times. We do a lot of things that cut people off, or we don't want you to do this or that. What are your thoughts on that? Do you sort of see that happening more and more?
I think more and more people want it for themselves.
Yeah. It's mine or no way.
Mhm.
Mine or I'll destroy it. So
The whole world, and especially our culture, seems to be very selfish.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, even the war over in Ukraine. That's Putin
Awful.
wants that land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
if he can't get it, he's going to destroy the land, right?
Destroy it.
Yeah.
Nobody.
No one will be able to use it. So even though we hear the story, and it seems like, many moons ago, it still applies today. There's still, we have the ability to, when we have an argument with somebody or when we think of solutions, what would it look like if we were looking at it from of how do both people have life from this decision as opposed to one person or both of us not getting anything at all? I mean, it's all or nothing type of thing. How do we go away from that all or nothing mindset and see, that, there can be, people can have a compromise. I mean, I just look at our politics right now. That's between both parties. It's all or nothing. Either I win or you lose. And what has happened to the ability to compromise anymore? We can't compromise. And so so I want you to look at that for this week. How, from this text that we're learning today, is how do we compromise? How do we look at having both people, in a sense, win? But it might not be the way that you think it is either, What do you all think? How hard is it to compromise nowadays?
Should be easy, but it's very hard.
Yeah, it should be easy, but it's very hard. Exactly. What makes it hard, do you think?
I want it myself.
It is. And a lot of TV commercials will tell you should have it.
Mm-hmm.
You deserve it.
You deserve it. Yes.
You hear that, and it just rankles me. You deserve it.
Yeah.
But it's the lack of loving your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Being worried about other people and looking to help take care of them.
And our pews in churches are not full.
Mhm.
No.
And any church, any getting closer to God, it has been put aside. And we certainly don't mix religion and politics. But without that conviction to work for the Lord and do what the Lord wants us to do,
Yeah.
we aren't going to see people try to come together
Right.
for the good of the people.
Right. Yeah, and I would argue that Jesus is very much a political figure. Very much so. And so how do you deal with that? Or you have a lot of nonprofits right now that aren't religious, which is totally cool. The hard part of that is a lot of times they won't work with religious groups. Or the other hard part of that too is certain religious groups won't work with each other. If you have a Baptist organization, will they work with a Lutheran church? Or a Catholic church, will they work with, just name your denomination. Do we do a good job of working together with other churches and ministries in order to help other people out?
I do think that the Lutheran World Relief or the Lutheran, the contributions to them have a good reputation
Yep.
for doing the best job to reach the people that need it the most.
Absolutely.
Getting where it's supposed to.
Getting where it's,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But the one thing I always think about is there's 5 churches in Cottage Grove, and they do a pig roast every year, and just how that always seems to go together. You know, and you have 2 Catholic churches, and I think the rest are the 3 Lutheran churches in town, but they all come together and do a pig roast every year, and they use that money for different causes. I'm trying to remember the different, like they do Stone Soup, which is sort of like our treasures. But you know how we don't see that very often. You see a church doing stuff. I mean, but how often do you see churches, especially across denominational lines? I mean, we do a little bit of that here in Baldwin. I mean, we have the ministerium where we actually have, you know, like the Good Friday events that we come together and we raise money for gas cards and stuff like that.
The
What about our
Tuesday
community?
suppers are
Yeah,
a good
Tuesday.
example.
Yeah, Tuesday supper is good.
Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Community
Tuesday.
supper?
Yeah, community supper as well too. So those are all good things that we can do to work together. So yeah, how do we compromise, work together, and be the people that we need to be in the world? And that's why I try to preach every week, because I need to hear that every week.
Aren't we kind of losing that community thing with community suppers when we don't get together? Everybody comes in their car and,
Well, that's the decision we're going to make
Yeah.
on the 1st.
oh, are you? Okay.
To see, no, First Reform is pick up this next time, so.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I said, it's a hard decision too. I mean, it
Oh, I'm
is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because like you're saying, the object of it was the fellowship of
Yeah.
everybody, and we're not having that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's another thing too to sort of think about as we think about this as well too, especially after the pandemic. That has done, I think that's one of the big events on all of our generations, you know, and how that affected how we have relationships with other
Yes.
people. And so I think it's going to be a long time before we've sort of figured out the effects of that and how do we deal with that? Because I think a lot of people are still struggling with loneliness, with grief, with a lot of things. Ambiguous loss. I just read a great book on that, talking about ambiguous loss, which means there's not, and the myth of closure, which I thought was a very interesting argument, that you never, and this is what I sort of believe too, that you never get over your grief. That your grief, you can manage your grief, but you're never fully over your grief, and that's okay. You know, there's not 5 stages to grief, according to this book, which I can live with. Yeah. So.
You think you're over it, but there comes a time when,
Something.
oh, I wish I had somebody here. What are they?
Or just just think too. There's going to be times when you think of your spouse when, there's a certain song on the radio, or it could be a certain flavor of food, it could be a certain smell in the air.
Holiday.
Yeah, and it brings you all right back there, and that's why I agree with her. I don't think there is anything as closure. Because these people have always been a part of your life, and closure means they're not. Well, no, they've always will, and they always should be a part of your life. So.
I think of my first husband going when the boys were so young, and I think, how would things be different if their dad had lived,
Yeah.
you know? And they'd had the example of him there, so.
Well, you probably would have been out in Pennsylvania and not Wisconsin.
That's probably true, but
I think you just gotta learn to live with it, don't you?
Yeah, and that's what the book was talking about. How do we live with loss, and how do we be resilient around being with that loss? And I think it tying it back to our text for today. How do we use God's wisdom to work together? How do we make judgments for life? Because at the end of the day, Solomon's judgment today was for life. It didn't seem like it at first, but what Solomon was really getting at was, how do we keep the child alive? How do we figure this out? And God's decisions are for life. And so how do we decide for decisions that lift people up versus tearing them down? And so this week, think about compromise. How can you compromise with somebody? What does that mean? What does compromise mean to you? And how do you compromise with somebody? And what kind of decisions are more life affirming or bring up the decisions between you and this other person you're having a hard time with? Or, how do we have those type of decisions? And you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to get it right all the time. I don't. But I want you to think about that. So, anything else about the text? Otherwise, next week we'll be in 2 Kings.
Did God actually test Solomon? That's the thought that he says, you ask for a good thing, you ask for wisdom.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you that. But I'm also going to give you what you didn't ask for. I'm going to give you riches and honor. And to me, it's like, are you going to put this wisdom to proper use?
Mm-hmm. Are you just saying what I want to hear? Or are you going to do what you're going to do?
Yeah, God does not tempt us, but he does
Test
us
us.
test
Yes.
of our faith.
Right.
And I just wonder if he was, added those things in there as a test of Solomon's great wisdom.
Right. No, I agree. And I think at times Solomon did not do a good job with his wisdom. So he didn't use the gift that God gave him. He let it go. So
Yeah, he could have used those witches for so much
yeah.
other than himself.
Yeah.
That's like if you win the lottery, what would you do with all that money?
That's very true.
700 million.
So I better buy a ticket is what you're saying.
No. Waste of money.
Huh?
You see these commercials for Publishers Clearinghouse or whatever, and one person gets $7,000 a week for life.
Right.
How much good could that be spread out instead of one person?
Think about what I
Yeah.
do with it.
Yeah.
Who would give
No.
it to? Her?
Yeah.
No, that would be that's a good thing to think about. So well, I'll do my message for the podcast. So thank you all for joining us for the podcast. We're going to go to prayers next. So please take some time to pray. If you have any prayer requests, please give them to the office. Put them in the comments section below or let me know. And thank you. And again, we'll be in 2 Kings for next week.